thing or something. Or live from the Miami Music Hall or Simon's house or something.
We need like you need like canned laughter or something. That's a StreamYard feature we need.
Where's my sound effect app? I should be going.
Yeah, Aaron had one that was really good.
You can tell all three of us are really hardcore streamers because none of us has like Stream Deck stuff, or we have rooms like this. I mean, at least Rich, you've got like a flat wall. I don't know what's going on behind me here. So
you're pretty good with the join the community.
Oh, look, I've even got my own plant.
Really? That's like a real office, Rich. It's so good.
I know. It's like, well, this plant's actually in quarantine at the moment because it's newly arrived, so we're making sure there's no bugs on it. So it's doing 2 weeks of quarantine in my room before it goes in with everything else in the other parts of the house.
See, like checking important family members. All right, I think we've got an audience now. This looks good.
Oh, we do. We've got 21 people. Apologies for that, everyone who's actually joined already. Hopefully it was entertaining, and hopefully you've all got a drink of some variety ready. It is 7 p.m. in Sydney. It's 5 o'clock somewhere else. So feel free to do what you need to do. And welcome to Alt.net.
Woo. Yes, welcome everyone. You chuck in a comment to show that comments are working, because there'll be a prize draw later.
I can do a comment. Oh, look, see, there's a comment. That was exciting.
We got some real people.
There we go. Comments not working.
Perfect.
Yeah, all right. I was going to say there's always one, but in our case, it's pretty much everyone.
It's always 20 to 30. Yeah.
All
right.
There it is. All right, so is the comment section sanitized? Francis, for you, probably. We need to definitely filter you. But for everyone else, no, go for it.
No, we just put Francis up extra big. Here we go.
Oh, where's his logo? He's got no face. Very sad. Oh, well.
All right, on to serious business.
Announcements, James, announcements. Should we do that first?
So interesting stuff coming up this week. There's on Thursday all day, there's NDC Melbourne, which is being streamed live and free as well. So I'll pop the agenda and the link for the live stream in the comments shortly. And I was planning to check out a few of the talks. Oh, look, extra good. Here we go. Simon's got it up. Here we go. I'll give you the actual agenda link. Hang on one sec.
It's pretty hard, ndcmelbourne.com.
Yeah.
Maybe people can't type Melbourne.
Agenda.
Sorry. Okay. NDC Melbourne.
Not sure if that is that like the right Norwegian accent for that.
Oh, don't get me doing one of those. I'll just embarrass myself and sound racist.
All right, so this Thursday anyway, I think Hanselman was doing the keynote, and there's some other interesting stuff on, so you might want to check it out in between your hard lockdown work. And
the Olympic streaming as well. So in between the Olympics events and everything else,
Just one on each monitor, right?
Hopefully there's people watching this and the Olympics at the same time. So if any medals happen while we're talking, or or the women win the basketball or the soccer or football, sorry, just otherwise I'll have to do that in the background. Sorry, what was that? What? Other things, 3 host 3 medals. Okay. A couple of other things of interest in the last month, probably just worth mentioning. .NET 6 preview builds keep dropping, which is great. We are at preview 6 now. Preview 7 will be out anytime soon. Look at that. There he goes. Clicking things.
Simon's really good value. Have you on our show again.
Thanks for teaching us how to use the internet.
And showing how to do the user group properly. This is awesome.
Because we were prepared. But yeah, so preview 6 is on it. So I know preview 7's not that far away. I've already seen a few updates from teams with Preview 7 builds of stuff, which is effectively the final feature addition build where they continue to add things out before it then goes into release candidate mode, and they start obviously doing perf tuning, even more perf tuning and bug fixing, and just making sure that everything's baked in well. Doesn't mean there's not going to be some more features turning up, but the bulk of it will be done at that point. And so obviously for us as devs, as we're looking at things and thinking about November 9th coming up, and what happens in terms of moving from the last stable, officially long-term supported version of 3.1 into 6, what does that mean for our plans and everything else? So definitely keep an eye on what's in there. There's a fair bit of movement, which is particularly good, and obviously continuing perf improvements and the small API footprint approaches for ASP.NET and microservices and all that good gear. So keep attention on that. And one of the interesting things that came out in Preview 6, Simon, system text JSON being provided as a source generator approach. So if you recall, you're not typing anything yet. What's going on, Simon?
Oh, hang on. What?
System.text.json source generators.
I'm sure it's going to be in here somewhere, right?
Google it with Bing or DuckDuckGo, which is my one. It's not in that preview page.
We prepared this all ahead of time.
Tricked you. But yeah, system text JSON source generator thing, something. Third one. There we go. So we did a topic on source generators a little while back. I can't remember when it occurred, but it was like interesting to see how it works and how it's coming through. And here's one of probably the first major versions of source generators occurring. And if you've got JSON serialization and you can avoid the reflection aspects of that and bake it in and build it in based on knowing exactly what's coming through and everything else, that can give some great performance improvements. So you can see kind of that table there showing serializer versus source generated versus a data access model, and what that means for startup times, which again, microservice kind of thing, especially for function apps or serverless approaches, and also just in general, just reducing memory footprint and keeping things fast. So really cool to see that coming. I'm kind of interested to see what else turns up in that space and other different patterns that might come out of that now that it's getting some adoption, which is awesome. And apart from that, that's pretty much it for me telling things of note for the last month.
Yeah, we've got our usual competition with the JetBrains license. So listen closely to Simon's talk, and I'll ask you 2 medium difficulty questions at the end. And whoever gets the answers first gets the licenses as per usual.
So one of those questions is going to be, what color T-shirt was Simon wearing during his talk?
I can't tell. Which color do we refer to? The black
That's
or the
other? Oh, I don't know. Let me. Oh, no, wrong way. Wait, there we are.
Got to move out of that.
It is a nice.
When you look at yourself on the screen, you're like, no, if I go that way, it's like driving.
I've got to go opposite to, and now I'm confused with life.
It is interesting, the minimal footprint stuff for ASP.NET. I've seen David Fowler talking a lot about that, and I think to your point, Richard, when we think about serverless microservices stuff, having that like really lightweight model for writing applications really sits well in that space, and I think that's what draws a lot of people to the likes of Node and Go. So it's good to see C# and .NET starting to add a lot of that capability as well. And source generators, I mean, this is great. I wonder how James Newton King feels about it, but I guess everyone's Newtonsoft favorite namespace is going to gradually start to decrease over time with .NET 6 and beyond starting to ship this stuff.
To an extent, but it's just like the system text JSON is very specialized in terms of it's got a core set of things it does, and it does well. But if you want full flexibility, then Newtonsoft is still the way to go. So, and James has even said that himself. He's like, yeah, do what you need to, use what makes you happy. Which is great. The other thing, just for the audience, is the color of the T-shirt, Azure. I don't know.
Yes, the color of the T-shirt.
Sort of dad jokes. I don't know if we should be airing those things.
No, is the answer. No, good try, but no.
Obviously, as we go through things and we hand over to Simon, for those who are on the stream, feel free to shout out questions as well as we go. James will pop them up on the screen, try and cover his own face this time instead of mine, which is a nice change, unless he moves the order around. And we'll go from there. So, Simon.
Yes, good evening.
Welcome.
Thank you very much, Rich. Appreciate being here.
Would you like to talk to us about anything in particular? Have you got anything on your mind?
Before I start, I actually have a colleague of mine here who's sending me some interesting inside skinny. So, tonight I'm going to talk about Windows containers and .NET framework applications. And I think, we'd all be familiar with the fairly large gaps when you come to native desktop style applications. So if you've done a lot of WinForms work in the past, a lot of WPF, and I guess more recently UWP, and I love mentioning those things because I get to say 3-letter acronyms without you necessarily understanding what they mean.
And then you get to add a 4th letter for Maui.
Yeah. I wonder how the people in Hawaii will feel about that, but that's okay. But I have a colleague who's actually based here in Australia, who you may have all met previously. So Igor is one of the maintainers of our open source path for the future of our, I don't want to say GUI, because that's not really fair. It's much broader than that, but our offer in that space. So Maui, obviously being a big part of it. But in .NET 6, there's a bunch of new stuff coming for Windows Forms apps. So I'm not going to talk about that in my talk tonight, but rest assured, if you are a WinForms maintainer or you're thinking about building native apps for desktop and not web, then there is still a path for you forward with .NET 6. And .NET 5 was really a starting of that journey, but I think .NET 6, they've started to plug a lot of gaps. But I'm sure if you've got any questions, feel free to chuck them at me later, and I'm happy to route them to the right person here.
So WinForms will work on Windows 11?
That's a good question. I can't answer that.
Can you run one now? Because you've got it sitting there, I can tell.
Have I?
Windows 11 in the wild, baby.
Yeah. Well, they've all got new icons. So, that's
look
just
at those rounded corners.
Notepad. By the way, if you are interested in a little bit more information about my talk, that's the short link, which I'll put up again at the end. As you can see, no PowerPoint, no slides, because I think we were all tired of PowerPoint only. And I think Richard and James made it a prerequisite to allow me to come and present tonight to accept questions and I don't know about insults from the audience. Oh, I've got Dave Wengier on here as well. How you doing, Dave? Don't read the comments on that blog post. Lots of people who just don't get the point about JSON.NET. Okay. Yeah, I think JSON.NET and Newtonsoft.json, I think it's one of those things where people get angry on the internet, and that's just another thing that they'll get angry about on the internet. It's a bit like your computer programming language is better than my computer programming language. Let's have a fight. It's like they're all pretty good.
Let's go.
Yeah. All right. So look, you guys okay for me to get going? we can have this like three-way banter for the rest of the evening, but it might be kind of boring for the rest of the folks who are here. Release the patent hounds. Yeah. Microsoft.
The audience will add that.
That's okay. Look, thanks a lot, everybody, for joining me this evening. Please do put questions in the comments on Twitch if that's where you're watching us tonight. Or if you're watching this later, wherever you're watching it, feel free to.
Then you're too late.
Oh, you're too late? Yeah, well, you can ask questions at any point in the future, either via Twitter or finding me online somewhere. Tonight, I want to talk about Windows containers and .NET framework applications. So when I take a look at the landscape for modern containerized apps and the .NET ecosystem, often I see people doing net new development using .NET Core and now .NET 5 and 6, oftentimes not targeting the Windows platform, and building cloud native applications, I guess is what we would call them these days. But what about that large volume of pre-existing .NET framework applications, some of which will probably never make the transition from .NET framework to .NET 5? For many reasons, most of them good reasons, in fact, either because they're tightly bound to the Windows platform, or they have hard dependencies on third-party libraries or services that just won't make that transition. So when I looked at this, I thought this is a topic that we need to talk a bit more about, because we kind of forget about a whole raft of the ecosystem when we are doing our work in this space. And Microsoft invested a lot of time and energy in the engineering necessary to make Windows containers a reality. And then additionally, the engineering effort to make Windows containers on Kubernetes a reality as well. So let's have a look a bit about what we're going to do. So I do want to start, I guess, with a reflection. Oftentimes as an industry, we love to do things because it's the current new thing to do. It's the cool thing to do. Perhaps we've got people tapping us on the shoulder and say, hey, we want to attract talent. The way we attract talent is we do new and cool things, and we say to everybody, hey, we're doing new and cool things. But I think when you start to talk about containerizing pre-existing .NET framework applications, you do need to take that with a grain of salt and think long and hard about why you want to do it. If the app runs well the way it does today, even if you're doing a cloud migration, do you really need to containerize it? And start with that as a starting point, and just don't blindly go, we need to containerize everything because that's the new paradigm that the industry is expecting from us. I'm not going to drain through all of these, but I think it's starting with, why would you want to containerize an app? Well, it's maybe that operationally your business has decided that its server-hosted application stacks in future will be Kubernetes and orchestration based, and from a consistency standpoint, from an operational consistency standpoint, and a developer experience standpoint, containerization and the workflows attached to it makes sense. I think in that case, you absolutely have the right sort of drive to want to go down this route. I do think pushing ops further left in your software development lifecycle is a big plus. Over the last sort of decade or so, Richard and myself and a lot of other people in the industry have worked hard when it comes to creating this idea of idempotent objects that get moved between environments, where the only thing that really changes is the configuration of those items. There are no code changes, there's no repackaging that occurs. And when we look at containers, that's a real bonus of using containers. Yes, you can still change them once they get deployed wherever you're deploying them to, but that state isn't persisted, and the next time a new container image is deployed, guess what? It gets overwritten. I think that's perfect from what today we would call, a more DevOps style way of working. So I think when we look at those two, we have a real reason to do it. I think the last one, which I've got here, which is better separation of concern between apps. Look, that's probably debatable. A properly configured machine with proper app domains is probably just as secure as a machine that runs multiple apps in multiple containers. With the size of the Windows container footprints, it's probably not as beneficial as it is with a Linux app to containerize an application to run it in a more secure container way on an individual host, just because you've got a much larger footprint for the underlying OS VM image that you're using. So that's kind of the drivers, but I do want to start off by saying you do need to think about it, and we will talk about Kubernetes later. I apologize for that in advance, but it is a part of the ecosystem, and if you are doing large-scale workloads, you need an orchestrator, and it's the de facto standard in the industry. And I also think you need to think long and hard about, well, we're going down this route because we want to use Kubernetes. I think it needs to be the other way around, is that we are standardizing on Kubernetes because it performs some item of value for our business. Therefore, we will use that as a driver to start to containerize our applications and then run them on Kubernetes. So don't start at the solution and figure out how you make everything work with it. Figure out why you want to end up with that solution. Any burning questions? Zing. Okay. Well, I'm assuming that's
no, it's the one before that. So
okay.
David said you're the only ones who worked hard, giving the rest of us a bad name. Well, the truth hurts.
Well, I could write a relationship process with the best of them. So, I did want to talk a bit about what sort of apps can we bring to Windows containers. So, Windows desktop apps, not a really good use case. You won't get them to work. Really, when we talk about containerization, we are talking about server-based apps, typically web-based, potentially APIs, things like WCF, SOAP services. If you do need to do app containerisation and virtualization, things like Microsoft AppV can help in that space, and increasingly things like Azure Windows Virtual Desktop and Windows 365 can also help do that for you as well without you having to worry about repackaging your apps. If you're stuck with .NET Framework 1.x or 2.x or under 3.5, unfortunately, you're out of luck. And someone did make a comment that, well, you can still run those apps on those platforms. Absolutely, you can, but you will receive absolutely no support from anyone for doing that. So basically, it's buyer beware, and you're on your own when you go down that path. So when I look at that, I think, well, .NET Framework 3.5 shipped in around the 2008 timeframe. So it means you've had a long time to manage the migration of your apps to .NET 3.5 and then potentially beyond. And actually, .NET 3.5 is the foundation release that you need to be able to hit if you want to use Windows containers to host your web applications or APIs. I'm not going to cover details of migrating from one of those frameworks to another. It can be done. A lot of people go, well, I'll use tools to do that. Tools will do the kind of common stuff for you, but it's generally the customizations that will take the time and energy for you to migrate. And actually, it's the same story when you bring stuff to containers as well, is that the sort of the simple run-of-the-mill stuff at the core of your application is probably going to be unproblematic to bring. It's then all of those customizations that you've made, typically where your business logic would lie, that will be where you will spend the time to uplift your application. Dependencies on that require a manual installation. So, you know, in the old world, you spin up a virtual machine or a server, and then, you know, someone follows a manual runbook to go in and configure that machine. Maybe you've got machine images sitting in your ESX environment or in your Hyper-V environment that have got a lot of stuff pre-installed for you. You can do that with Azure VMs. You can use images to spin up VMs that have got all your dependencies installed. However, when you start to look at doing container builds, you don't have the flexibility to do manual post-container image build installations of third-party tooling. You can automate it, as I've commented on here in the blog entry, but the more of those things you do, the more brittle your build and release process will be. And typically anything that's going to require you to touch things like the global assembly cache or the registry or anything that requires any form of manual intervention through some form of user interface is pretty much out the window at this point. So we've got an example there of using a bit of PowerShell to download the IIS node extension for IIS and install that and do that at the command line. And you can do that in a Docker build file. So you can actually do some automation, but if you do have third-party tooling that you rely on for deploying your application and you can't automate it or you can't remove it or do something like turn it into a third-party service you can call and just run that stuff on a VM, then you are sort of in a no man's land and probably not a good candidate to bring to Windows containers. Okay, is Windows containers based on Docker?
We got a question from Francis.
Yeah. Is it easy to convert a Docker container to a Windows container? Well, Docker, think of Docker as the standard framework that defines what a container is, and a container that can run on top of a Docker that adheres to the Docker standard can either be a Linux container or a Windows container. So you don't have to convert a Windows container to a Docker container, and in fact, we'll see that in a minute. Is that Docker has inbuilt support for both Linux and Windows containers. So in the same way you can build a Linux container, which is oftentimes synonymous in a lot of people's minds with Docker container, you can also build a Windows container. Docker is just the hosting mechanism that provides all the infrastructure like virtual file system overlays and security and a lot of the other aspects to it as well. So hopefully that answered that question.
It won't be offended if you don't.
All right. So the next bit I want to talk quickly about, and this one's quite interesting. If you've done a lot of work in the Windows Server space and the ops space, maybe you haven't been working with the more recent release style that Microsoft uses for Windows Server. or Windows desktop, actually, for that fact. And this one, actually, for me, I don't work much in this space, so it took me a few goes to try and wrap my head around the way this is being done. But I think if you come from a Linux background, then the way that Microsoft's doing Windows releases now probably sits a little bit easier with you. Now, Windows Server 2016 and 2019, two well-known products, probably still come in a box for those people that want it. Those releases are part of what's known as the long-term servicing channel, or LTS, for Windows, and they get updated sort of every 3 years or so. But then there's this new concept called the semi-annual channel, or the SAC, which gets updated much more frequently than the LTS releases. And that's where you start to see these really weird server versions like Windows Server 20H2. And you've probably seen that if you've been following the sort of the Windows 10 to Windows 11 story. You can choose to take your images from either the LTS or the SAC channels, and it's entirely up to you. For me personally, I think if you are trying to adhere to the more modern, agile way of doing things, you're probably going to be wanting to look more towards the SAC channel. However, I can imagine in many businesses where maybe you've got a lot of traditional ops folks in the company, you might want to stick to the LTS channel so that you've got a well-known, base image that you could potentially have based on a corporate image that you've built yourselves. So I don't go into that too much detail here, but basically making the decision for your base image is important, because when you build a Docker container, you'll always pull it from a base image of some sort. So when we have a look at how we do that for our demo app tonight, you'll see that we're actually using one of the LTS releases as part of our base image. Okay, cool. What else have we got in here? All right, so that's kind of.
Did you want to cover Nano Server and other things as well?
So you've got yeah. So I do cover it here, I guess. So you've got Windows Server Core, Windows Nano Server, Windows, and Windows IoT Core, just to confuse everybody, on top of LTS and SAC. We probably have about 6 no, I'm just joking. We don't have 6 licensing things for those individual items. But the goal, and it covered here, if you want to use Nano Server, you really have to be working on .NET Core applications already. To my mind, if you're on .NET Core applications and you're not running them on Linux, then you must have some hard dependency on something in Windows. I wonder if at that point Nano Server is off the table, and then you have to go to Windows Server Core.
I think the thing with Nano Server is it gives you a base that you can then start putting just the bits on that you need for your application, versus taking like a full Windows server and chopping back.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I
think it takes more effort to build the image you want, but if you've got a lot of them and you're trying to really optimize, then Nano or Server Core is a good point to start.
And to Richard's point, the order I have them in is Server Core, Nano Server, Windows, and Windows IoT Core. I think that in terms of actual base image size, Nano Server is the smallest, followed by Windows Server Core. And then Windows is kind of like the granddaddy, and the Windows base image is like 8 gigs or something, I think, once you finally build it out. So generally speaking, in the containerized application space, you want your images to be as small as possible, because it means that they take less time to rehydrate out of container storage and get up and running. So as Richard said, if you want to really cut down the footprint of your container and make sure it's only got what you need, then you start with that Nano Server. My suspicion is that a lot of people would just go, "Oh, just give me the Windows Server because it's got everything, and I don't have to
definitely easier." Yeah,
I'm doing that. And as I said here, Microsoft also publishes some base images that come with preloaded components. So the one we'll do today comes preloaded with ASP.NET and the .NET framework. So if you want to do multi-stage build, which we'll have a look at, we provide images that have got Windows plus .NET Framework 4.8 pre-installed on them, so that when you pull in that image, you can do a bunch of stuff knowing that you don't have to install the framework, it's already there. And then there's a runtime image that just comes with all the bits necessary to have a runtime ASP.NET 4.8 application up and running, which is really cool. So I can see I'm at half an hour. I've talked a lot. Let's do a bit of demo. And the demo I'm going to use is MVC Music Store, which is kind of a classic. I'm just going to see if there was any questions on the other channel I have here.
Yeah, I have a quick question here from Stephen on, is it being Windows Server Core or Server Core?
It's Windows, I believe it's Windows Server Core. Let's have a look. Good question. Let me get proved wrong by the internet in real time. What is Server Core? Correct, it is Server Core. There we are. So you're right. Thank you very much for that. I will correct.
Success.
I will correct my blog appropriately. Thank you. That's all good. I will note I'm not a container expert, but I also think that that's a good thing, because if I can do this, you can do this. When I wanted to do this demo, I didn't want to start from scratch. There's a lot of kind of 101, let's take a file new project style application in .NET and do this to it. I wanted to take something that had been around for a while and might have some of the sorts of challenges that you would see in a pre-existing app. So I started with the MVC Music Store app, which originally came from Codeplex. So it had got pulled across by this user called Evil Dave from Codeplex, and it seems to be the officially referenced version from Microsoft. So I thought I'll just fork a copy of that. I starting with that. First thing I did is I opened it in Visual Studio 2019, and the 2019 first thing it did, that's not the right one we want. Sorry about this, folks. First thing it wants to do is it needs to upgrade itself so that it can work with the latest version of Visual Studio. Because the code base is just a tad bit old, we have to upgrade a few things like the MVC framework, so it's running on the latest release. Thankfully, all the tooling inside of Visual Studio did that for me. I had to go through and make some manual changes to things like the target framework. So I set it to .NET Framework 4.72, which I'll talk a bit about in a minute. And then I added some additional packages. Now, these packages are interesting. So I won't drag all the way to the bottom of this blog, but basically in containers, you want to inject your configuration at runtime. And if you think about ASP.NET in particular and .NET Framework applications, generally speaking, a lot of this was done through configuration files or reading things, say, from the registry. And the idea that you have environment variables driving the experience, it doesn't really work in the Windows world. You can do it, but traditionally it wasn't a way that we did things in the Windows world. We would do things like use web deploy to deploy a web application package, and we would change the web configuration on deployment to update it using the tools we had available at the time. We don't want to do that when we're doing container images. We bake the image once and we put it somewhere, and then we want, when it starts up, we want it to read that configuration from environment variables rather than off of disk. So the way that we do that is we add this package here, which is called Microsoft Configuration Builder's Environment. And it's a new package. It only targets 4.71 and above. So if you do have an app older than that, you either need to figure out how to move it to 4.71 or above, or look at backporting this into a scenario that would suit you. And once you've installed this particular package into your solution, what you can then do, and I've got the application here open. I'm going to try and zoom. Hopefully my screen doesn't hang up here. Oh, it didn't hang up. Good. Wrong screen. Okay, it zoomed both monitors. Awesome. Thanks for that. So you can see I'm sitting in a post-containerization branch. So this is actually sitting up on GitHub if you do want to go and find it. Let me just pull that up quickly. So you'll find that branch here in post-containerization. So this isn't yet ready to be pushed into a Kubernetes world, but it will give me a container that I can run. When I add, excuse me, this package, I get a new config, couple of config sections set up. So I get this config builders and entity framework gets added in. And then I add in a new config builder. And there are a few different sources that you can use for config builders. The one I'm interested in is the environment package builder. Let me just zoom in on that a little bit. So I'm using the environment one, which has been pulled out of a particular assembly. And then what this allows me to do is it allows me to go through individual settings sections like, say, app settings or connection strings, and say, actually ignore what's contained in the web.config file except for the key, and read the value from the environment variable. So where I've done that for this particular sample application is in my connection strings. So MVC Music Store uses Entity Framework to connect the SQL Server on the back end. You'll see here that my connection string just says ignored because it's not actually used. Because I've decorated my config string section with config builders equals environment, when my application boots, the underlying configuration at startup knows that rather than reading from the config file or some other third-party location, I'm just going to look for an environment variable that matches this particular name. Now, I realize I don't have my environment variables open. Yeah, so let me just quickly open those. Let me just open this over here, make sure that I'm not telling you any of my deepest, darkest secrets.
Do it.
Do it. Nope, doesn't look like there's anything there that shouldn't be on the stream. And you'll see here I have an environment variable called Music Store Entities, which contains a nice long Azure SQL database connection string in this case, which I'm using in place of a local SQL Server instance. And what will happen is if I now run this, and I haven't made any other code changes to my application, I haven't had to go and write, configuration override code in any of my code. All I've literally done is install this additional NuGet package and then update my connection string setting to use the environment config builders. If I come up into my application here and I hit debug in IIS Express, everyone's favorite local web server from before Kestrel was a thing. All right, could not copy, cool. So not only am I using Visual Studio 2022, I'm on Windows 11, so I'm living on the edge. When you use Docker containers at the moment, sometimes it gets a bit caught up and needs a bit of a clean. So it forces a Docker RM in the background to remove your container, even though I'm not actually focusing on Docker in this instance. It is defined. You'll see there's a Docker file over here in my application definition. So I'm just going to start this up. With this, you'll be happy. So this is a fairly standard experience as a developer. Hitting F5, getting the local debug experience. This is just running through IIS on my local machine. It might take a little while because I'm using Azure SQL Database serverless, so it'll take a few seconds just to warm the engine back up and then serve my data. While that's thinking about it, where we're going to go is, we'll go back to Visual Studio. And now I chose IIS here, but you also saw I had Docker. I can choose to containerize my apps really simply in Visual Studio by doing right-click on the solution, doing add. Come on, you can do it. And where are we? Somewhere in here. Probably because I'm debugging, it's not showing it at the moment. But basically, I can add in a Docker container reference. I can also now add in Kubernetes additional configuration management as well if I want to. So not only do I containerize each individual application project, I can also then determine how Kubernetes will deploy that. But I've already been through this step, so I've got a result.
I don't think you get the Docker thing because it's already detected the Docker file being there.
And it's really straightforward, right? So you can see here I'm pulling from the Microsoft Container Registry. Note, we don't use Docker Hub anymore with all of the changes Docker made around pull limits for containers, and we're also doing the right thing because we need to own our own stuff. We've been using Microsoft Container Registry or mcr.microsoft.com for a while, so if you are still pulling our images from Docker Hub, you're probably getting build errors by now, I think, because I think we've stopped supporting that. But it's basically gone off and pulled down the .NET Framework ASP.NET image, which is tagged 4.8 Windows Server Core, and then that LTS that we were talking about, 2019. So it's Windows Server Core 2019 with ASP.NET 4.8 pre-installed on it. So I don't actually have to go and manage that container image. It's already got everything I need. And then literally all I'm doing is copying the output from the build in Visual Studio across to that image and then booting it up. It's a pretty basic file, and it works really well for local debugging. Let's just go and see if that loaded up. Hey, everyone's favorite MVC music store. So I'm not sure why that one's called Balls to the Wall. We'll go to Restless and Wild, and we'll add it to a cart. So we should see that it adds to the cart at some point. Do it, good. There's my cart. Okay, good. So that's tested. So that's running locally through Visual Studio and IIS. Now I've already containerized this, so I can do the same with Docker. Now, fingers crossed this works, because Windows 11 and Docker don't always get on with each other. So sometimes the host name lookup for the remote host name for the Azure SQL database stuff isn't happy.
And are you running on WSL2 as the backend? Is this? No, actually, wouldn't be. It's Windows container. Yeah.
Good question. So when you use Docker Desktop as it is now, you have a choice. You can either run it with a WSL2 backend or a Hyper-V Windows container backend. If you are doing Windows container development, what will happen?
WSL2 doesn't make sense. I'm an idiot.
Yeah, and what'll actually happen is, if you are doing WSL2 Linux-based dev, and then you switch over to use Windows containers, what'll happen is the first time you try and run this, everything will figure out, oh, we're trying to do Windows containers here. WSL2 doesn't work, and it will actually reconfigure Docker for you to use the necessary backend bits, assuming you have all of the Hyper-V stuff installed on your local machine. So I guess the gotcha there for larger dev teams is potentially, if you are doing, Docker containers with Linux, and you are using WSL2 locally to support that, and you want to do Windows containers on the same dev boxes, you probably will have a bit of churn changing backwards and forwards between those backends. But the good thing is, from my experience, that actually on this machine I was using WSL2 previously, and using remote container with Visual Studio Code to do some work. And the first time I ran this application inside Visual Studio, it went, oh, actually, no, you've got the wrong configuration. Do you want me to change it? And I went, yes, please. Now that seems to have gotten itself tied in a knot again. So let's just clean this. It's usually a bit smoother than this. I suspect it's just because I decided to use Visual Studio 2022 preview for this versus 2019. So it was a bit more stable in 2019, albeit I was using a preview of 2019 as well. I can see David was here. Don't worry, if you understand Microsoft naming, it's time to seek help.
Yes. Gareth's comment's an interesting one.
You don't have to switch if you enable experimental, true in the Docker engine. Yeah, okay, look, I must admit, I as I said before, I'm not that close to it, so I'm not trailing sort of exactly what's happening in that space. So
good tip,
it's good to see that they're making that. That's interesting. Why is that sitting over the top of your? Let's close that. That's sitting over the top of my screen. You don't need to see that. All right. So you'll see here it's trying to connect to a really weird local address, 172.31. So that's my local Docker host. So this is actually my Docker desktop app. You can see that in terms of images, we've got my MVC music store, which is my dev one. So Visual Studio already tagged it with a dev tag for me. This is the base image that got pulled down by my Docker file. And then this is my actual running container serving on port 1479. So it looks like it's having a bit of a think about connecting for that. So we'll leave that. Hopefully that'll run, and we'll come back to that. Right. So we've made our containerized application configurable via environment variables. That's the one gotcha I will talk about. While that's debugging, let's see if we can do this. So I set the environment variable up in my Windows environment variables. Now it's going to pop up. Cool. So I set my environment variables up in my Windows environment variable settings. And then I ran my container and things didn't work. I was like, well, what's that? I've already set my environment variable in my Windows machine. Anyone in the audience want to take a guess why it didn't work when I ran it? See who's been paying attention. I'm looking down because my screen's down here. No. Thumped everybody. Come on, be brave. Hey, and that's containerized version. So the 172.31 that we can see up there. So that tells me that it's containerized version of the app, which is cool. So it's still talking to the same SQL backend, but the application's running inside it. And inside Visual Studio, I could now debug this as well if I wanted to. I could put breakpoints and they would be hit and returned back into Visual Studio for me. Interestingly, my card is empty. I guess probably because my session ended and I'm not logged in.
Alan's got a.
Alan gave you an answer.
Needed to restart Docker to get the new environment variables. No. Good guess, but no. So you've got your Windows host, my desktop. That's where I set my environment variables. And then I've got my Docker host. My Docker host doesn't receive the environment variables from my Windows host because it's not the container host. Does that make sense? I don't know if that's maybe, you've got Windows, that's like my desktop, and then I've got my actual Docker application that's doing the serving of my Docker images when I run them. I haven't provided the environment variables into my image when I've run it. Now you can do that from the command line. When you use Docker run, you can pass in command line arguments that get passed into the container as environment variables. The other way that you can do it is you can pass in an environment variables file, and that's actually the way we solve it here. So, and I can't claim ownership of this idea. This was definitely something that came to me via the overlords at Stack Overflow. So what we need to do is we need to do a couple of things. So we have a build event, which is a pre-build event, because we want to create this file before we actually build our Docker container. So what we do is we actually take the environment variable in my Windows host and we echo it out into a local file called debug_config.env. And then what we do is we actually pass that into the Docker environment and tell it that that's the file we want it to use to populate the local the local environmental configuration values at runtime. And when we do this, we then can basically pipe in all of the local config that we want and provide it into the runtime environment without actually having to create this really long Docker environment variable setup that we would then have to manually maintain over time. By creating this file, we can add as many items as we want to this file and they'll all show up. And literally all it is just the environment variable or the environment variable you want to show inside of the Docker container, and then the actual value from your local environmental settings inside of Windows. When we do this and we run the Docker container, what we can actually see is we can see that item will show up as an environment variable. So to prove that, let's just open our containers.
We got a comment from Francis as well about using a Docker composed file instead.
You could potentially. So what I'm trying to do here is make it as easy as possible to use the default artifacts that we get out of the box from Visual Studio as a local F5 debug experience without having to do a lot of other work outside of that. So you could potentially modify the Docker file to be a Docker compose file. I haven't tried that. That's potentially an option. But just to finish off the point I was making before was, here we can actually see this is my MVC music store debug image that was previously created by my build. And then I can see my music store entities environment variables being populated through us providing this file to the Docker engine when it actually runs the application. So if we come back to here, where are we? One of these files here, I will find it later. So by doing this, we've now got a full debug experience. So, we saw the ability to debug locally, as we do today, and then we've also got the ability to debug a containerized version of that image, but that's only part of our journey. Okay, so now that we've done that, we need to be able to run it at scale. And I think, running it at scale is really where something like Kubernetes comes into play. Yeah, I could take this containerized image and I could run it on something like a container host on a virtual machine inside of Azure or cloud provider of choice. or I could run it on a container image instance inside of Azure as well, right? But then I start to lose benefits of maybe hosting multiple versions of my web front end in a load balanced environment, which would be a pretty traditional way of doing things in most businesses, is that you typically run more than one version or one instance of your web application or API, so that you can make sure that it's always available, which is where you absolutely need something like Kubernetes to do that with containers. Which brings me to the last bit of the talk. I did promise I would talk about Kubernetes, but only very lightly.
We did put it in the keywords for the session.
Go hard, go hard.
Go hard, all right. But I'm going to start by talking about GitHub Actions, because I use GitHub Actions to actually build and do two things: to build the container image, push it to Azure Container Registry, which is where I'm going to store my container images. I could just as easily push it to, say, Docker Hub or a private container registry if I've got one. And then author a Helm chart, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute, and then use that Helm chart to deploy my web application into Kubernetes. So I'm not sure who in the audience has used GitHub Actions yet, but they're super powerful. And if you've been using Azure DevOps and the YAML definition in Azure DevOps, then this will feel very familiar to you. So we're doing a couple of things in this job. In fact, let me do this because it's probably easier to visualize it through the graphical representation of the build. So I'm doing three things. So I'm building and publishing the Docker image. So that's literally what I've been doing inside of Visual Studio locally and publishing it to Docker on my local desktop. But when I want to use it in production, I want to take that image that I've built and push it to a container registry. I also don't want to build that image on my local machine and push it to a container registry. I want to follow best practices and do it in one location, which has got a consistent configuration. So I'm doing a build and publish Docker image, and then I'm building and pushing a Helm chart. So think of Helm charts as a standardized way of doing Kubernetes application deployment. You can still do standardized Kubernetes app deployment using lots of nicely defined YAML files in your custom custom layout on disk that you want. The benefit you get with Helm is you get a nice consistent layout and approach for specific components inside of Kubernetes that you might need to deploy and configure, and also a bundling and deployment and versioning strategy, which you might not have if you use just the standard out of the box Kubernetes way of doing deployments. And then once I've built that Helm chart, I then use it as a mechanism to deploy into Kubernetes. In this case, I'm using Azure Kubernetes Service to do that. Now, I will say that if we look at the Docker file here, does anyone want to take a guess whether this is fit for purpose to build and deploy a container image to container registry and then into Kubernetes? And there's no right or wrong answers here. Just have a good guess.
What do you mean there's no right or wrong answers? It's a yes or no.
It's a yes or no. All right. Okay. I was trying to be open and welcoming.
You're being gentle. We said go hard.
Don't you need a push? Don't you need to push?
It's like giving birth to a baby.
Yeah. So there is a push. There is a push missing here for sure. But thinking about my local workflow, I don't really want to push the image anywhere, right? I'm just going to keep it locally on my machine. So look. To be honest, this file is not going to help you very much. If you push this into container registry, into GitHub Actions and say build this file, you're going to have to do a lot of other work to actually push it into container registry and potentially do things like configure the application for release. So at the moment, this file would give you a debug build, which is something that you can use locally. We don't want that for our production release. So the way we solve that is, let's see, let's come over to the right branch here, is we need to build our own container Docker file that we can use for CI. And it's still going to look a little bit similar, but there'll be some extra steps involved in here. So I'm doing a multi-stage build here. So the first stage, I'm actually using the full framework SDK as my build host. So it'll have things like MS Build and the entire BCL available to me to build. I can't necessarily do that with the runtime environment because it doesn't necessarily have all the build tools, and neither should it. That's generally a good security practice, is to have minimal footprint on deployment to production, so that if you do get an intrusion, people don't have tools to be able to build and deploy software in your environment. They can only literally run what you've deployed. I then copy across my solution files and my CS project files, and I do a NuGet restore on those files, and my config file, I should say. I then copy the output of that build to my work directory, and then I actually run an MS build. So MS build's available on this host, so I know that it's there, and I say, build me a configuration release and put that on disk. And then in my next stage, I use my runtime environment. So this is the one that I mentioned in the blog post, and it's actually the one that we saw referenced earlier. So this is literally just the .NET Framework ASP.NET 4.8. If we go and have a look at the definition for that particular container image, we'll find that one of the underlying layers will be something like Nano Server or Server Core, but we don't have to worry about that here. We just say, give me this one, and then the underlying layers will be managed for us by the definition in that Docker file, and then copy the build from the build output from our machine, and that gives us our final container image. And this one actually is fit to run in a production environment. Now, we wouldn't do this in a local debug build Docker file because we wouldn't get that F5 debug experience. But for a centralized build and deployment, this is the way we would do that for an ASP.NET web application. All right, so we've talked about that. So no one needs to know how to set up Kubernetes. The other thing I'm going to do, so we talk about environment variables. Environment variables are really easy to pass into Docker when it's Docker run, and you can pass in a bit of text, or using a file like we did for my local debug builds. But when you start running it in Kubernetes, you need to think about ways to do this that are different from the way you do it, in your dev environment, but not without having to then write rafts of code to do am I in dev, am I in production, and all those sorts of things. And we're already using environment variables, so we actually really need a way that just allows us to map environment variables. And one of the ways we can do that with Kubernetes is we can define these centralized assets called secrets. They're not really secrets, they're just base64 encoded strings, but they're called secrets in Kubernetes. And then at runtime, we can actually tell the underlying container image, when it's booted up by Kubernetes, that Kubernetes should inject the environment variable using the secret as a source for that. So what we need to do is, I'm just going to zoom in on this, is we need to define a secret for Kubernetes. This is a bit of YAML, and we will use that to deploy a secret. We take the configuration entry, which was our connection string, and we need to base64 encode it. Now, on Linux, it's pretty straightforward to do base64 encoding, but this is the way you can do it with PowerShell if you're a Windows dev end-to-end and you don't have WSL or any of that other fun stuff. This is the way you can do it on your local machine. And then what you'll get out of that is a nice encoded base64 encoded value, which you actually put into your secret definition. And then when you deploy this into Kubernetes, you can actually have the code that you use to deploy your Kubernetes container images into Kubernetes. You can say at runtime, this environment variable, and we'll take a look at this in a minute, can be hydrated out of the secret store in Kubernetes and using this particular piece of data. So a secret in Kubernetes can have multiple bits of data contained in it. For this purpose of this demo, we're only doing one. So it's called DB connection, and it contains one piece of data, which is called connection string. Yep, so you can also use kubectl create secret at the command line if you want to do that. Absolutely, you can. And the reason that I didn't do a lot of kubectl in here, you'll see it gets a mention just here after that, is there's a lot of black magic involved in Kubernetes if you're not familiar with it, and it can feel a bit like sometimes you just type in commands without necessarily understanding what it is you're doing. And you may not also have kubectl on your local machine to be able to deploy stuff. So with this file definition, we can give it to somebody else and say, here, this needs to be deployed, rather than here, run this command. And we can also do things like, probably wouldn't version that because it's going to have your secret in it, but you could generate it at runtime or build time if you wanted to, and pass that as an asset across. What I'm going to just quickly do here, so I'm just going to hop into my AKS cluster, and I can see that we're right at time, so apologies for this. I will try and wrap this as quickly as possible, because I know Rich has got some stuff he wants to go and watch at the Olympics, apparently.
Yeah, gymnastics will be on. Oh, and you can hear the background noise. There's probably something happening up there.
All right, so I'm in here inside of AKS. So if you worked with Kubernetes before, you may be familiar with the Kubernetes dashboard. We no longer install that by default with AKS because it's a challenge to keep it up to date, and it has been a good source of security issues in the past. So we no longer make that available. So if you do kubectl browse inside of an AKS cluster these days, you'll be directed to the Azure portal. But everything you can do inside of the traditional dashboard, you can also do here. So what I want to do is I'm going to have a look in the configuration secrets, and I've already deployed my secret in here. So it's all the way down here at the bottom, so we can see it down here. No, don't hit F1, whoops. So you can see it DB connection there, and it's type opaque. And if we open that up, you can see that it's there, and then I can also do unhide it because it's base 64, so it's it's two-way. I will change the password on that before anyone else thinks that they can get in.
Just give me a few minutes before you do.
Yeah, there's nothing in there apart from my demo app, so it's not a problem if you do
not
get
yet
in.
Anyway.
Yeah, there's no secrets contained in there. So now I have that deployed. I have a Helm chart. I'm going to define a Helm chart, which will help me actually deploy the application into Kubernetes. And I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time. Oops, don't hit the wrong button, Simon. I'm not going to spend a whole amount of time digging into my Helm chart. I did promise there would be no slides, but you do have to put up with a little bit of scrolling. So once I've got my application and I'm ready to go, I install the Helm tooling on my local machine. And then in the root directory, and this can be on Windows, it could be on Linux, but on Windows in this case, in the root directory from my app, I issue the Helm create and then the name of the Helm chart I want to create, and it will spit out a scaffold of files for me that will do some basic stuff. Rather than dig through the rest of this this blog post, we'll come back up to the root of this folder.
You've got to say here's one I prepared earlier.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm only going to go through the bits that I guess really matter in this instance. So the chart definition file is pretty straightforward. The versioning, you can do things like update versioning in real time on build. I haven't done it in this case, but you could potentially inject those values at build time if you wanted to. Values is where we care a bit more about it, because we can do things like say, okay, this image definition comes from my container registry. So this would be, again, something that you would update to deploy from yours. I thought rather than just leaving it as a default, we'd at least give it some value so it shows up meaningfully inside of Kubernetes. We were going to expose it using a web load balancer on port 80. We define what we want in terms of host resources, so the amount of CPU and memory. I don't want it to be auto-scaled, but I do want a minimum number of replicas of 1. And then the most important thing in here is actually I want to tell Kubernetes, if you've got multiple node pools and some are Linux and some are Windows, please put this on Windows. And if you don't do that, Kubernetes will find the first available node that it's got and just put this app on there. And if it's not a Windows container, your application is obviously not going to work. But that's the kind of the key thing that you need to add. So that doesn't come out of the box when you create a Helm chart using the default commands. And then the other important stuff in here is on deployment. What we need to do is we need to define this end block here. Just zoom in on that. And we basically say, okay, I want to create a new environment variable on the Docker host when the container spins up called music store entities. Actually, I want to pull the reference for that from the DB connection secret and the key. So the value out of that secret that I want to use is called constring. And then what that will do is when the container image boots, Kubernetes will say, hey, here's a new environment variable for you that contains the connection string basically to your Azure SQL database in this instance. Now, if the gods have smiled on us, and I think they have, or the demo gods, I should say, we'll see here that everything's got a green action against it. And I will admit to you, you know, there's a lot of people that kind of go, oh, I get this right every time, first time, and I'm not one of those people. And to give you an idea of how I'm not one of those people is I spent probably a good chunk of today trying to figure out why my container wouldn't work in Kubernetes, only to discover at some point that it was because I had the firewall settings on Azure SQL database set to allow protection from other things in Azure. And I'm an Azure expert, apparently. So look, if I can do it, you can do it. And I updated my blog accordingly to make sure that if you do use Azure SQL database, that you do remember to check that firewall option, which rightly has it set to off by default so that you can define exactly what you want to talk to it. But nevertheless, when we can build the container image and push it, what we're actually doing, so we'll open this step here. We use kubeconfig. We've got the security config for Kubernetes stored as a secret inside of GitHub. This allows us to connect into the Kubernetes API. We add our custom Helm repository locally, which is our Azure Container Registry, which can also hold Helm charts. We do an upgrade. So this is actually taking our custom package, which is our MVC music store, and issuing an upgrade on it. So upgrade will do, if it's a new fresh install, it will do an install, and if it's an existing install, it will actually install the updated package over the top of it. If you use just install rather than upgrade, if the package already exists, you'll get an error and it won't install anything because it's going, no, there's already something there, why would I overwrite it? And then the benefit of this is that we can use Helm to manage our deployments. We get a bunch of extra metadata around the outside of our Kubernetes deployed application components that we can then manage and know exactly what's going on and bundle into this one sort of lump of things that we can deploy without having to manage multiple individual files. So now that it's deployed, going back into our AKS, and I'm almost done, I promise. We get a couple of things in here. So we get a new service of type load balancer with a public IP address. So let's just click on that. And hopefully it should load pretty quickly because our database is already awake. So we've gone from desktop to container to being able to debug in a container to being able to build a container image of our ASP.NET web application running on .NET Framework and Windows containers. Having that image built and stored in the centralized repository and container registry, and then using Helm as our package manager effectively to deploy that into a Kubernetes cluster. And we haven't had to change any of the code to do that. All we had to do is bring it up to minimum of 3.5 if we want it to be basic support, and then if we want to use environment variables, we need to go to 4.7 or above to be able to make that happen. So we've got our load balancer there, and then we've got our workload deployed in the back end here. So if we come and have a look at our deployment, you can see our MVC music store deployment here. We can see we've only got one node running on that. So we could theoretically go in and edit that and update that so that it's going to have more than one node being required. So there should be
nice work.
Yeah. All right. Look, I could scroll through Kubernetes configuration for forever, but I guess the bottom line for me, I will put that up quickly over there. If you are interested
in the chat,
learning a bit more about that, that short link there would be a good place to go and have a look. My blog obviously has got 3 blogs on taking you through this journey. It is an interesting space. I think it's a niche space. I don't think a lot of people will go down this route. But if you are considering doing it, I think it's viable. It will probably come with some heartache along the way, and I think a lot of that heartache will be potentially the years of technical debt that have built up in the code bases that you're trying to port. And unfortunately, there's no silver bullet for that. And it's a common story I see a lot in the .NET framework space, where people have stayed on supported and well-loved versions of the framework for a while and haven't seen the business benefit of making the migration to a more recent release of the framework. And now, unfortunately, they're starting to see some of the drawbacks. But the good thing is the .NET framework's got a long support tail ahead of it. .NET Framework 4.8 is not going away anytime soon. So, you know, continuing to invest in building .NET Framework apps is not the end of the road. You're not looking at like a 12 to 18 month window here. But I would say, you know, if you're doing net new today, unless you have a burning need to be doing .NET Framework, you're on .NET 5 and soon to be .NET 6. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. Apologies for being 10 minutes over time. I skimmed over a few things really quickly, but yeah, they're all in detail in the blog, or hit me up. I don't even have my name or details on here. How about that?
Do you want to post it
You've
in
got your Twitter handle
comments?
and your name.
Yeah, speaker bio. Go and click on the speaker bio.
Yeah, put that short link in the comments, Simon.
Can I actually add comments? I don't know if I can add comments.
Oh, you can't?
No.
Oh, well.
Everyone knows who I am. I wish that was true. No, actually, I don't wish that was true. I'm quite happy, actually.
I'm internet famous.
I did have, and I hope the person's not on the call tonight. I did have somebody get into a lift once upon a time with me in Sydney and go, "Hey, you're that Azure guy," and I was like, "I'm not sure how I feel about that. But I'll take it as a good thing."
Yeah, if you pop it in the meetup comments, is probably the best thing.
Cool. I'll do that. I'll chuck a few links. Look, thanks a lot, everybody, for having me. It's been great. Any questions, let me know. Otherwise, hey, Olympics are awaiting us.
Well, not quite yet. We've got to do the important stuff at the end.
Competition time.
Oh,
well, yes.
Giveaways.
All right. Well, I was going to ask what Richard was going to have for dinner, but I thought that probably wasn't the right question. So I found some other ones. So first one, why would you use Nano Server?
No, it's not because the JetBrains Olympic is about to start.
Yeah.
Gareth, yes. Because, oh, geez, Francis.
I think we got one decent answer from Gareth.
It's funny, after all these years, I've just realized there's a typo on my blog entry on that page. How about that?
Oh, the silly cunt.
Silicon valve.
Very silly silicon. All right, Gareth, that is awesome. Send me a message on Meetup with your email address, and I'll send you through the license. I think Stephen's one seems like a good one too, but Gareth got in first for that one. And the second one, all right, so when would you use a Helm chart?
Music, typing music. Gavin!
We got three answers very quickly.
Muttley.
Gavin,
everyone.
Well, I can't even click it. We got so many answers coming through. Yeah, I'm not sure. You didn't Google it, right? No, you should have been listening. No, so Gavin, send me a message with your email address, and I'll send you through the license as well. And sorry, everyone else, you have to come back.
Technically, Chris's answer is more correct because you don't do a Helm chart just to deploy something to an app service, for example. But we know what you mean.
What do you think? I leave it to you two extra judges to decide. Are you happy with Gavin's, or should we go with Chris's?
I reckon it's first in, best dressed.
Yeah, and you've already given it away, James. Jeez.
Yeah. All right. Gavin, we won't welch on you. Send me your email address. And,
tiebreaker question.
I think the moral of the story there is Chris just needs to come to the next meetup and get in first for an answer.
Yeah, that's right. We'll have another 2 licenses next month. So, yeah. that's the best option. All right. Oh yeah, if anyone's got anything they want to talk about, I think we might have Francis actually giving a talk next next month.
A talk or a rant? I'm not sure yet.
No, I think the talk one on some debugging tools. So we've got a spot. Maybe I thought you were. To be confirmed then, but yes. Yeah.
We could do, and if not, there's a fallback anyway. So.
Yeah, we might have 2 short talks. We'll see. So if you've got something you want to talk about, then drop us a message on Meetup or comment very quickly now before you disappear.
Yeah.
Hey, I just want to say thanks a lot for having me along tonight, and thanks for keeping the meetups going. I know it's really hard when it's set up like this, and I know with everything that's going on, it can be a challenge to get the motivation there. But I think it's great that people like yourselves are still doing this, because it's important. Fun. It helps keep people connected and gives them a focus that they might not otherwise have. So big thanks to you, Richard and James, for doing this.
Definitely,
really thanks to you, Simon, for actually doing
all the work. Yeah,
that's what I was about to say, Richard. What Richard said. Simon did all the work.
No, you did all the work, James. You organised it. I just kind of I slacked off this month. I do want to say, just as we wrap up again, for those who are in lockdown still,
like us, for example,
like all of us, pretty much.
Yes.
Yeah, if stay connected. There's enough of us who live alone as well that just things like this is great to connect with people, which is pretty much all of us. Yeah, our hearts are with you, and just stay safe, stay isolated, and get through it. And .NET 6 Maui and Mac Catalyst. Michael, we did a Maui one a couple of months ago, so we'll probably pause on that at the moment. But if you want to try and do that WinForms on iPad Pro bit, go for it. We would love to see that crazy talk. And Francis, stay vaccinated, definitely. I've still got another 5 weeks to go for my old man AstraZeneca jab 2.
Stay vaccinated. That's a consistent state to stay vaccinated.
Yeah. Okay. So get vaccinated. Add yourself to the queue. We'll get there. So again, crazy talks are always good talks. We like that too.
On the iPad Pro, it sounds good.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Yeah. Send us an email, by the way. With more on your talk there. That sounds, if you focus on the WinForms on the iPad Pro part, that sounds pretty cool. I'm sure if you could get that to work, you'd have a lot of takers for your technology. There's a lot of WinForms around, I mean.
We want to see the WinForms part, like the .NET 6 and Maui and Mac Catalyst thing. That's kind of...
Everyone does that.
We want to get something meaty, man. Somebody that makes us scratch our heads and go, why the hell would you do that in the first place? And then, cool, you can do that. Such a great thing to put on the CV. Correct. All right, you idiots.
What is our audience, Richard? No, Richard meant us.
Oh, right, yes. I definitely never give the audience a hard time.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. And we'll see you next month.
We're out. Mic drop, all that sort of thing. Hit the end, James. Hit the end.
The end is nigh.